And now we're going to transition into the first of two panel discussions. And the first panel discussion is looking at the policy level and how that kind of European cluster policy, those trends over time, how has European cluster policy changed over time, kind of the broader context in which both of these projects and all of the regions and clusters are acting. And then have a discussion with the panel members of how these kind of broad policy trends get enacted on a regional level and on a cluster level. So we're going to have a discussion about this. And I'm just going to start out by taking a little historical trek through European cluster policy. And just so that we're all on the same page, when we say cluster policy, when I use those words, what is it that I mean? And I equate cluster policy with cluster programs on regional or national level. So it's organized efforts by government to enhance the competitive advantage of clusters in their constituency, of businesses, of academic institutions, of societal actors, those actors acting in collaboration. So government takes some these frameworks that Alex was talking about to create the frameworks for increasing competitiveness. And those cluster programs or cluster frameworks, those policy frameworks can come in different forms. They are born out of a number of policy families. In some instances, they're born out of innovation policy or technology policy. In some instances, regional development policy. In some instances, industrial development or SME support policies. And in some cases, cluster policies can kind of embed all of these policy areas. But different cluster programs can be focused on different aspects. And Europe is not alone. These kind of cluster policies and programs exist all over the world. This is just kind of a little from the European Cluster Collaboration Platform, just some examples from other parts of the world of their programs. And you can almost tell by the titles which policy family they're more focused on. If it's kind of industrial competitiveness or regional innovation cluster initiatives, things like this. They kind of take a different perspective depending on which policy family they're born out of. But this is just to say that we're not alone. And it's very crowded up in the European part of the world, and a lot of the cluster programs that you are representing are not listed, for instance. This is a slide from Christian Kettles that he's presented in a number of different fora. But this is a nice example of how the modes of cluster policy have evolved, both over time and different parts of the world kind of tilt their cluster policy in different ways. That can be either initially focused on creating linkages, getting people together in the same room to talk and create better linkages between the different actor groups, to over time becoming more tactical, to delivering research and innovation funds through these cluster initiatives to deliver funds more effectively, to being strategic. So if a cluster initiative has developed to be have a good collaboration, for instance, as Energy Valley seems to be, that the regional government can use these cluster initiatives as strategic partners. So moving from policy for clusters to develop clusters and to create linkages to becoming more strategic over time. And different parts of the world have different focus areas of their cluster policy and use clusters in a different, more or less strategic way. And I think that even European cluster policy, the things that on the European level, that they have also moved a little bit from kind of ad hoc, sporadic, working on creating linkages to using clusters more strategically. This is just my opinion. We heard about Porter. So Porter is kind of the godfather of all cluster thinking and cluster policy. And he came around with his competitive advantage of nations in the 90s, early 90s. And it didn't take long before a number of regions and countries around the world starting to create these frameworks, to work with cluster policy. On the European level, back in 2000, it was a lot of what are clusters, where are clusters, what role for policy, a lot of just initial, what is this? There's a lot of talk. most of the action, the policy development, was on member state level. So on the regional and national level, member states, they were doing a lot of things. And in European Union was waking up to what's going on and what can we do on European level. So they started their first kind of mapping of the policies through the Interbarometer, and then they started some European cluster mapping in new member states, so those kind of mapping activities. And then in the most recent, 2007 to 2013, there was a lot of activity. Okay, now we know where they are, that they exist, and the member states are working on this. So we want to, on a European level, build strength in the clusters. We want to encourage excellence. We want to build world-class clusters. So how to build strength and improve what clusters do. So kind of raising the bar. If everybody's working with cluster policy, then how can we make sure that we're doing it as best as possible, as ambitious as possible? And in the current program period, the questions are about, okay, now that we have strong clusters, ambitious cluster initiatives, how can we use them to do new, different, more things? And all of the buzzwords that we've heard in the presentations prior and that we've heard that the regions are working with, it's okay, industrial modernization, Industry 4.0, it's about new cross-sectorial value chains, it's about interregional collaboration, it's about helping SMEs to go international, and it's about smart specialization, but also smart interregional specialization. We heard from the Northern Connections, it's like these value chains and renewables, how can we make these activities, the regional innovation strategies are more open and that they're thinking about broader innovation strategies. These were accompanied by a number of activities. So from a European level, they had their programs or their frameworks. As I was mentioning, there was a lot of mapping in the beginning and kind of observing what was going on. And then there was a big rise of a whole bunch of different, both on the policy level, InnoNet's policy learning and policy development, the cluster observatory that took care of mapping and analysis, InnoActions, which were more cluster-to-cluster collaboration, regions of knowledge were kind of on the research side, and then the European Cluster Excellence Initiative, which was working with cluster organizations to increase the level of management capacity. So there's a lot of excellence on all fields, analysis and policy and cluster collaboration and also cluster management. And in the current programming period, there's been a little bit of a kind of meshing of these things, so the innovation, now that innovation policy is within Horizon, but they're seeing things that they're seeing the benefit of not necessarily viewing it in regional policy or competitiveness, industrial policy, or innovation policy, but they're seeing the benefit of kind of meshing, using the cluster instrument as an instrument to address all of these policy areas, and also in a coordinated fashion. So you get these programs with the InnoSoup with cluster facilitated value chains, and you have the smart specialization platform on industrial modernization trying to get these value chains in particular thematic areas, regions to team up. But I think from a European level, they're starting to see clusters as an instrument to fulfill all of these things, but in a package, so that we can use cluster initiatives to enact all of these policy families and policy areas, and a little bit more reliant on the regions to have these open innovation strategies and develop these strategies that enable these things on a ground level. The EU policy framework for clusters has broadened, so that's the kind of the bottom line. It's stretching across regional development and innovation and industrial policy and also entrepreneurship and startup and scale up. It's seeing cluster initiatives as instruments to address all of these areas, and the frames are kind of referencing each other. This was presented by the head of unit for clusters within DG Grow about a month ago. So this was kind of what we have to look forward to over the next few years, the outlook for European cluster policy. There are a lot of new activities underway. There's a launch of a new cluster observatory coming up in the next I think, few months. They're signing the contracts now. They're planning on European Cluster Weeks. So we have European Cluster Conferences historically. Apparently, we have the European Cluster Weeks to look forward to in the future. A stronger use of these thematic smart specialization platforms. Rima had up the smart specialization platform for industrial modernization. So using the key enabling technologies, how can we use these in different ways to hook up regions and cluster initiatives together to do bigger, broader things? And that's how I also interpret this last thing, the joint cluster initiatives. What is a joint cluster initiative? But I think maybe a joint cluster initiative is thinking of, okay, instead of just looking, as Alex was saying, regions and cluster initiatives have a tendency to look to develop their own. It's how can we develop it jointly? So hooking up together and going at it jointly. So this is a little bit of a wandering how European cluster policy has developed over time.